When most people think of Winston Churchill, they picture a man standing outside number 10 Downing Street, cigar in hand, making the famous V sign for victory. They hear the speeches that rallied Britain during the darkest days of the Second World War. They remember the defiant Prime Minister who refused to surrender when much of Europe had fallen under Nazi control. Churchill has become one of history's greatest political figures, a symbol of courage and determination during the most difficult of times. Yet behind this public image was another Churchill, one who sought not power, but peace, tranquility. Away from Parliament, military strategy and political arguments, he would often disappear into his studio or set up an easel in the garden, on a hillside or beside a lake. And there, dressed in old clothes, splattered with oil paint, he became simply another artist chasing light across a canvas. Over the course of his life, Churchill completed more than 500 paintings. Far from being a casual hobby, painting became one of the defining passions of his life, helping him survive political failure, personal despair, and can you imagine the unimaginable pressure of leading Britain through war? Churchill was born on the 30th of November 1874 at Blenheim Palace in Oxfordshire. The grand country house built for his ancestor, John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough. Although born into one of Britain's most famous aristocratic families, Churchill's childhood was often lonely. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a rising politician who had little time for his son, while his American-born mother, Jeannie Jerome, led a glamorous social life that frequently kept her away from home. Churchill later admitted that he longed for the affection but rarely received it. Instead, he found comfort in books, history, and the companionship of his beloved nanny, Elizabeth Everest, whom he regarded almost as his mother. As a young man, Churchill showed little sign that he would one day become a painter. He attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst before serving as a cavalry officer in Cuba, India, and Sudan. Alongside his military career, he established himself as a journalist and an author, reporting from war zones with remarkable energy. His daring escape after being captured by the Boer war officers in South Africa turned him into a national celebrity almost overnight. And by the age of 25, Churchill had already become a soldier, a war correspondent, and a best-selling writer, and a member of Parliament. Politics quickly became his life's work. Brilliant, ambitious, and fiercely independent, Churchill rose rapidly through government. He held several senior positions before becoming First Lord of the Admiralty in 1911, where he was responsible for preparing Britain's navy for the growing threat posed by Germany. He thrived on responsibility and leadership, often working extraordinary hours and involving himself in every detail of government. Friends admired his energy, but also noticed his restless personality. Churchill seemed incapable of switching off, even during holidays. And when he went away, his mind remained fixed on political problems, military planning, and speeches, which he loved to give. That relentless drive came at a cost. Churchill was prone to periods of deep melancholy, sometimes famously describing as his black dog days. Whether the phrase referred to clinical depression in the modern sense is still debated by historians, but there is little doubt that he experienced episodes of profound sadness, self-doubt, and emotional exhaustion. During these periods, even simple tasks could feel overwhelming, yet Churchill rarely allowed others to see this vulnerable side. In public, he projected confidence, humour, and resilience. Great humour. He was one of the funniest men of his day, with incredible quotes, masking struggles that remained largely private to him. The greatest crisis of his early political career came during the First World War in 1915. Churchill championed the Gallipoli campaign, an ambitious attempt to force the Dardanelles and knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war. The operation ended in absolute disaster. Poor planning, difficult terrain, and fierce resistance led to the deaths of tens of thousands of Allied soldiers, especially the Australians. Although Churchill was not solely responsible, public opinion turned sharply against him. He was forced to resign from the Admiralty and found himself politically completely isolated. The fall was devastating. Only months earlier, he had stood at the centre of government. Now he watched from the sidelines as his career appeared to collapse. Churchill later admitted that this was one of the darkest periods of his life. He felt humiliated, powerless, and uncertain whether he would ever return to high office. The pressure fed his black dog, and those close to him noticed a man weighed down by disappointment and depression. Then, almost by accident, everything changed. During a family gathering, Churchill watched his sister-in-law, Gwendolyn Churchill, painting outdoors. She noticed his curiosity and invited him to try. Churchill hesitated at first. At 40 years old, he had never painted before and feared looking ridiculous. Eventually, he picked up a brush and made his first uncertain strokes on the canvas. That simple moment transformed his private life. Churchill later recalled the experience with remarkable honesty. At first, he felt intimidated by the blank canvas, but within minutes he found himself completely absorbed in its texture and the oil paint and what he could do with it. The worries that had dominated his thoughts began to fade. Instead of thinking about newspaper criticism, political rivals, or military failure, he was thinking about colour, light, shadow. He discovered something he had rarely experienced before, a mind fully occupied by the present moment, by the landscape that he found himself in. Painting became an escape, unlike anything else he had known. He once wrote that the muse of painting came to my rescue at a crucial time in my life. It demanded complete concentration. Every brushstroke required a decision. Every change in light forced him to observe the landscape more closely. There was simply no room left in his mind for anxiety or politics. What began as a curiosity quickly became an obsession. Churchill bought brushes, canvases, palettes, and easels, studying the techniques of professional artists with the same determination he had once applied to military strategy. Wherever he travelled, he painted, and equipment travelled with him. Family holidays became painting expeditions, and they often ended with Churchill setting up his easel in fields, gardens, or by rivers, while others relaxed nearby. For perhaps the first time in years, he had found an activity that had nothing to do with ambition or politics, success or failure, no longer depended on newspaper headlines or parliamentary votes. A painting either pleased him or it did not. The stakes were wonderfully low. It was refreshing for Winston Churchill. In many ways, this was the beginning of Churchill's second life, not as a statesman, but as an artist. It was a side of his character that few people expected, yet it would remain with him for the next 50 years. Through triumph and disaster, through world wars and election victories, through moments of celebration and despair, Churchill would always return to his canvas. And remarkably, the paintings he produced reveal a man very different from the one remembered in history. They contain no battlefields, no explosions, and no politics. Instead, they are filled with shimmering lakes, warm Mediterranean sunlight, quiet gardens, and peaceful countryside. The man who spent his days making decisions about war spent his free time searching for beauty, colour, and stillness. It is one of history's great contradictions and one of its most fascinating stories. If politics was Winston Churchill's profession, then painting became his sanctuary. Following the catastrophe of Gallipoli, Churchill found himself in one of the darkest periods of his life.
Ladies and gentlemen, the vote you will give on February the 23rd is of profound importance to your future, your homes and families, and our country are all involved. The choice is plain. Are we now to take another plunge into socialist regimentation, or shall we return to the high road of freedom, of enterprise, and with proper safeguards, opportunity for all?
Churchill approached painting with exactly the same determination that he applied to everything else. He read books on technique, studied the work of great painters, and eagerly accepted advice from professional artists. He wasn't content to dabble. He wanted to improve every day. One of the most prominent figures in his artistic development was the celebrated Irish portrait painter, Sir John Lavery. Lavery recognised that Churchill possessed genuine enthusiasm and encouraged him to paint boldly, worrying less about perfection and more about capturing light and atmosphere. Churchill listened carefully, learning how colour could create emotion and how loose brushwork often produced a more convincing landscape than painstaking detail. His influences came largely from France. Churchill admired the Impressionists, particularly Claude Monet, whose paintings transformed ordinary landscapes into shimmering studies of light. Like Monet, Churchill became fascinated by the way sunlight changed throughout the day. Morning light produced cool blues and soft greens, while evening filled buildings and trees with rich oranges and golds. He also admired Paul Cézanne, whose structured landscapes demonstrated that nature could be simplified into powerful shapes without losing its beauty. Churchill never attempted to imitate these artists directly, but their influence is unmistakable in his increasingly confident handling of colour and composition. His favourite place to paint was his country home at Chartwell in Kent. Chartwell wasn't simply a house. It became Churchill's personal retreat from the pressures of Westminster, and he threw himself into improving the estate, building brick walls with his own hands, creating lakes, planting trees, and designing gardens that would later paint again and again and again. He loved his garden. The property became both his home and his outdoor studio. Visitors often recalled seeing Churchill wandering across the grounds carrying an easel under one arm and a paint box under the other. He worked quickly, trying to capture changing clouds before they drifted away, or the afternoon sunlight became disappearing behind the trees and the light fading. His enthusiasm was infectious, as with everything in his life. Even after long days at Parliament, Churchill would often return home and immediately head outside to paint if the weather allowed. Family members remembered him talking excitedly about colours and compositions with the same passion that he discussed in politics. Unlike many amateur painters, Churchill wasn't embarrassed by making mistakes. He believed confidence was essential. He once advised beginners to attack the canvas boldly, arguing that hesitation was the enemy of good painting. And I massively agree with that. It was advice that reflected his entire personality. Whether leading armies or painting landscapes, Churchill believed in committing wholeheartedly to whatever he did. And as the years passed, painting became woven into the rhythm of his daily life. It travelled wherever he went. During holidays in the south of France, he painted olive groves, harbours, and sunlit villas. In Italy, he captured ancient buildings glowing beneath Mediterranean skies. But it was in Morocco that truly captured his imagination. Churchill believed that the light of North Africa was unlike anywhere else on earth. The colours appeared stronger, the shadows deeper, and the skies impossibly blue. He said he'd never seen blue like the Moroccan skies. Standing before the ancient city of Marrakesh, with the Atlas Mountains rising in the distance, he found endless inspiration. These paintings reveal something surprisingly about Churchill. Despite spending much of his career preparing for war and later leading Britain through its greatest conflict, his art contains almost no violence. Instead, his canvases are remarkably peaceful. They are filled with gardens in bloom, quiet lakes reflecting the sky, warm stone buildings bathed in afternoon sunshine, and distant hills disappearing into soft blue haze. It is almost like Churchill deliberately painted the world that he wished to exist. For him, painting wasn't simply a pastime. It was a way of him preserving hope. By the time the Second World War began in September 1939, Winston Churchill had spent more than 2 decades with a paintbrush in his hand. What had started as an experiment after the disaster of Gallipoli had become a complete passion. He had painted hundreds of landscapes, studied the work of Impressionists, and developed, by this time, a confident style of his own. But now Europe was at war, and Churchill's life would become consumed by the greatest challenge he would ever face. On the 10th of May 1940, as German forces swept across Western Europe, Churchill became Prime Minister. It was one of the darkest moments in British history, and within weeks France had collapsed. The British Army had been evacuated from Dunkirk, and Adolf Hitler appeared unstoppable. Churchill worked extraordinary hours, often sleeping only a few hours each night before returning to meetings with military commanders, cabinet ministers and foreign leaders. Every day brought reports of bombings, casualties and setbacks. The responsibility resting on his shoulders was immense. To the public, Churchill seemed almost indestructible. His speeches projected absolute confidence.
Nothing is neglected, and if the best arrangements are made, as they are being made, we shall prove ourselves once more able to defend our island home, to ride out the storm of war, and to outlive the menace of tyranny, if necessary for years, if necessary alone. At any rate, that is what we are going to try to do. That is the resolve of His Majesty's government, every man of them. That is the will of Parliament and the nation. The British Empire and the French Republic, linked together in their cause and in their need, will defend to the death their native soil, aiding each other like good comrades to the utmost of their strength. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall fight with growing confidence and growing strength in the air. We shall defend our island, whatever the cost may be. We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender. And if, which I do not for a moment believe, this island or a large part of it was subjugated and starving, then our empire beyond the seas, armed and guarded by the British fleet, would carry on the struggle until, in God's good time, the new world, with all its power and might, steps forth to the rescue and the liberation of the old.
One of the most remarkable stories linking Churchill's art with world history took place in January 1943. Churchill travelled to Casablanca in Morocco to meet American President Franklin Roosevelt. Together they discussed military strategy and planned the next phase of the Allied war effort. It was one of the most important conferences of the war, shaping the campaign that would eventually lead to victory. But once the formal meetings had ended, Churchill suggested something completely unexpected. He persuaded Roosevelt to drive with him to the hills outside Marrakesh to watch the sunset over the city. Churchill believed that the view, with the red walls of the ancient city standing before the snow-covered Atlas Mountains, was one of the most beautiful landscapes in the world. As the evening light slowly changed, he pointed out the colours shifting across the mountains and the warm glow spreading over the city below. Roosevelt rarely had opportunities to pause during the war, yet Churchill insisted that this view was worth seeing, and it was. Shortly afterwards, Churchill painted the scene himself. The finished work, Tower of Kumbayata, became one of the only paintings he completed during this phase of his life, during the Second World War. He later presented it to Roosevelt as a personal gift. The painting was more than a landscape. It was a symbol of friendship between two leaders whose partnership helped shape the course of history. Today it remains one of Churchill's most famous works, combining his love of painting with one of the defining moments of the 20th century. After the war ended in 1945, Churchill briefly lost office before returning as Prime Minister in 1951. Although politics still occupied much of his time, he was now able to devote more attention to his painting. He travelled again to France, Italy, the Mediterranean, always carrying with him his painting equipment. Churchill often painted in silence. Visitors remembered watching him work with remarkable concentration, stepping backwards every few minutes to judge the composition before adding another confident brushstroke. He painted quickly, preferring energy over perfection. His favourite subjects remained largely unchanged throughout his life. He loved still water, reflecting clouds, ancient stone buildings glowing in afternoon sunshine, colourful gardens, rolling countryside. Perhaps this was deliberate. Churchill had witnessed more conflict than almost anyone of his generation. He had reported from the battlefields as a young journalist, commanded government departments through 2 world wars, and made decisions that affected millions of lives. Yet when he stood before a blank canvas, he chose not to paint destruction, but instead he celebrated the peace of the world. His paintings remind us that even history's greatest wartime leader longed for quiet places where nothing existed except trees, water, nature, sunlight, and sky. In 1948, the Royal Academy recognised Churchill's contribution to art. They elected him an honorary academician. It was an unusual honour for someone with no formal artistic training, but it reflected the respect he had earned through decades of serious commitment to painting. Churchill himself was deeply touched by this recognition. It confirmed something he had always believed, that art was not reserved for professionals alone. Anyone willing to observe carefully and paint honestly could experience its rewards. Just create. Try to create something. By then, Churchill had produced well over 500 paintings, and together they form an extraordinary visual diary spanning more than 40 years of his life. They also revealed a side of Winston Churchill that many people never knew existed. Not a politician, not a soldier, not a wartime leader, but a man who found hope, balance, and happiness through colour, light, and the simple act of placing paint onto canvas. In the decades leading to his death in 1965, appreciation of Churchill's art has continued to grow. His paintings have been exhibited in galleries around the world and are held in museums and private collections. While they are undoubtedly linked to the fame of their creator, they are admired for more than their historical connection. Art historians have praised their confident brushwork, vibrant colour, and genuine feeling. Perhaps Churchill's greatest achievement as an artist was not the paintings themselves, but the example he set. He proved that creativity does not belong only to professionals. He began painting at the age of 40, after a devastating political failure, and with no formal training and very little confidence at the beginning. Yet, through determination, curiosity, and sheer enjoyment, he developed a body of work that continues to surprise and inspire people. When we remember Winston Churchill today, it's easy to focus solely on the speeches, the cigars, and the wartime leadership that defined an era. Those achievements deserve their place in history, of course, but they tell only part of his story. Behind the public figure stood a man who wrestled with self-doubt, periods of depression, and crushing weights of responsibility that he had to bear. And he found relief not in power or prestige, but in paint, canvas, and the quiet observation of the natural world. And perhaps that is the most enduring lesson of Churchill's artistic life. Even in the midst of crisis, there is a value in creating. Winston Churchill left behind many legacies. He helped shape the 20th century. It's a reminder that history's greatest figures are rarely defined by a single role. Churchill was a soldier, a writer, an orator, a speech maker, a prime minister, an inspiration. But he was also just a humble artist. Winston Churchill spent his final years quietly at his beloved home, Chartwell, surrounded by his family, his books, and many of his landscape paintings. On the 15th of January, 1965, Churchill suffered a severe stroke at his London home in Hyde Park. He remained gravely ill for several days and died peacefully there on the 24th of January, 1965, at the age of 90. Remarkably, he died exactly 70 years after the death of his father, Lord Randolph Churchill. Britain mourned the loss of one of its greatest statesmen, and he was honoured with a state funeral, the largest ever held for a British statesman. His coffin travelled down the River Thames before being taken to Bladon, near Blenheim Palace, where he was buried alongside other members of his family. Churchill's greatest contribution to art was not simply the paintings he left behind through his book, Paintings as a Pastime. He inspired countless people to take up painting, regardless of their age or experience. He believed creativity belonged to everyone, not just professional artists, and that the act of painting could restore confidence, calm, and the mind to bring lasting happiness to it. Today, visitors to Chartwell can still walk through the studio where Churchill painted, see the easel he worked at, and view many of the landscapes that brought him such peace. They offer a glimpse of a side of Churchill that history overlooks, a man who found beauty amid conflict. And in the end, Winston Churchill left behind two rememberable and remarkable legacies. One changed the course of world history. He won the Second World War for the British Empire, and he saved Europe. And the other reminds us that even the busiest, most burdened lives can be transformed by the simple act of picking up a paintbrush.